Welcome to this deep dive into the 5, what Jack the Ripper's victims knew, and what London erased. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this as we uncover the real stories behind the canonical victims. Mary Ann Nichols was far more than the label of first victim that history pinned on her. Born in 1845, she was a mother of 5 who had endured a failed marriage, institutionalization in a workhouse, and the grinding poverty that forced countless women into the streets of Whitechapel. She worked as a domestic servant when she could and turned to casual prostitution only when every other option collapsed. Those who knew her described a woman who still carried herself with quiet dignity, someone who laughed with friends in the lodging houses and worried about her children even after they had been taken from her care. On the night of August 31st, 1888, she left the kitchen of 18 Thrall Street around midnight after failing to raise the 4pence needed for a bed. She told the deputy keeper she would soon return with the money and stepped into the damp fog of Whitechapel Road. What she might have observed in those final hours remains one of the most overlooked threads in the case. Nichols walked streets already tense from earlier unsolved attacks. She would have passed the same dark corners where women whispered about the murders of Emma Smith in April and Martha Tabram in August. Both women had been savagely assaulted in the same small radius Nichols now traversed. It is entirely plausible she discussed these killings with other unfortunates that evening, comparing notes on which alleys felt unsafe and which clients had grown rougher in recent weeks. Those earlier Whitechapel murders formed a pattern Nichols may have recognized before any official investigation did. Smith had been attacked by a gang that used a blunt instrument and a knife. Tabram suffered 39 stab wounds, many of them focused on the torso. Nichols herself received the same signature injuries plus the distinctive throat cut that would define the later crimes. The connections were visible on the ground long before the press or police drew them. Women like Nichols traded this information in lodging house kitchens and at street corners because their survival depended on it. Yet the official record contains almost nothing of these conversations. Police documentation of Nichols' background and connections was strikingly incomplete from the outset. Detectives recorded her name, age, and the fact she had been drinking, but they failed to map her network of friends, regular clients, or the specific workhouses and doss houses she moved between. No one collected statements from the women who had shared rooms with her the previous week, or from the men who had seen her earlier that night. The inquest focused narrowly on the moment of discovery rather than the weeks leading up to it. This gap meant any warnings Nichols might have carried about a single predator operating in the area were lost before they could be recorded. London press coverage completed the erasure. Within days, Nichols was reduced to the stereotype of a drunken, fallen woman whose life held no value beyond the sensational details of her injuries. Newspapers printed lurid descriptions of her body while omitting her attempts to hold a job, her separation from her children, and the systemic failures that had left her on the streets. The human being disappeared behind the label prostitute, a word repeated so often it became her entire identity in the public mind. Later histories inherited this flattening, repeating the same shorthand without returning to primary sources that showed a more complicated woman navigating impossible circumstances. At the crime scene itself, evidence vanished or was never collected. The narrow passageway of Bucks Row was trampled by onlookers and police boots before any systematic search could occur. No photographs were taken of the body in situ. The blood pool was not measured or sampled. Witnesses who lived in the adjacent houses were interviewed only cursorily, and their accounts of hearing or seeing anything unusual were dismissed when they did not fit the emerging narrative. Most critically, no one canvassed the surrounding streets for the women Nichols had spoken with earlier that night. Those potential links to the earlier attacks on Smith and Tabram were never pursued. The pattern that existed before anyone named a killer was therefore visible to the women walking those streets, but invisible to the authorities who controlled the record. Nichols carried knowledge of that pattern in her final hours, knowledge that died with her because the systems meant to protect or at least document her life chose instead to simplify and discard it. What remains is the outline of a woman who understood the dangers around her better than the official investigation ever would, and whose connections, observations, and warnings were allowed to slip away into the fog before the wider world even realized a pattern existed. Annie Chapman carried the same fragile knowledge of Whitechapel's dangers that Mary Ann Nichols had tried to navigate just 8 days earlier. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841, she had once lived a more settled life as the wife of a coachman, raising 2 children in Windsor before drink, illness, and separation pulled her into the same cycle of workhouses, casual labor, and street work that claimed so many others. By 1888, she was known locally as Dark Annie, a slight woman in her mid-40s who still tried to keep herself presentable, selling flowers or crochet work when she could and turning to the streets only when the fourpence for a bed at 35 Dorset Street proved impossible to earn. Friends described her as steady rather than reckless, someone who listened carefully to the stories other women brought back from the night before, and who had already begun to adjust her own routes after the attacks on Emma Smith and Martha Tabram. On the evening of the 7th of September, she left the lodging house early, first stopping at the Britannia public house on the corner of Dorset Street, where she drank with acquaintances and spoke openly about the recent killings. Several women later recalled her warning that a single man, not a gang, seemed to be responsible, and that he had begun choosing victims who worked alone after midnight. Chapman mentioned having seen a suspicious figure near the same spots where Nichols had been found, and she advised others to stay in pairs if possible. These conversations were not idle gossip. They reflected the same pattern Nichols had recognized weeks earlier, now sharpened by another week of whispered reports. Chapman left the pub around 11 and was seen again near Spitalfields Market. Still short of her lodging money, she told one friend she would try the streets near Hanbury Street, an area she knew well from previous nights and one that had already produced rumors of a man offering pills or money in exchange for quick encounters. Those rumors had been circulating through Hanbury Street and the surrounding courts for days. Women spoke of a stranger who carried a black bag and claimed to be a doctor offering treatment for ailments common among the unfortunates. Some had heard he paid well but insisted on darkness and alleyways. Chapman would almost certainly have heard these warnings, and her decision to work that particular stretch suggests she either discounted them or believed she could manage the risk. Around 5:30 in the morning, a market porter saw her speaking with a man outside 29 Hanbury Street. The man was described as foreign-looking, wearing a deerstalker hat and dark coat, but the witness was never pressed for further details. Minutes later, Chapman entered the narrow passageway beside the house. What happened next occurred in a backyard already familiar to local women as a place of temporary shelter. The community warnings that had reached Chapman were far more specific than anything the police recorded. Lodging house keepers and street sellers had been repeating stories of a man who targeted women after the Nichols murder, someone who asked questions about previous victims and seemed to know their routines. One woman claimed to have seen the same figure watching the Doss houses on Thrall Street the week before. Another reported being offered a suspicious draught that made her feel ill. These accounts traveled quickly among the women who shared the same beds and kitchens, yet they never appeared in any official log. The inquest into Chapman's death, held at the Working Lads Institute, focused almost exclusively on the medical evidence of her injuries and the moment her body was discovered by a resident of the house. Coroner Baxter allowed testimony about her movements earlier that night, but cut short any questions about the rumors she might have heard or passed on. Witnesses who tried to mention the black bag man or the warnings circulating in the pubs were redirected to simpler facts of identification and timing. Key witnesses were dismissed with striking speed. The market porter who saw Chapman with the stranger was never asked to look at photographs or attend an identity parade. A woman who lived at 29 Hanbury Street and had heard low voices in the yard was told her account was unreliable because she had been half asleep. Another resident who reported seeing a man washing his hands at a nearby pump was brushed aside as mistaken about the time. Police notebooks from the period show no follow-up interviews with the women Chapman had drunk with at the Britannia, even though those same women had already shared information about Nichols. The connections between the two murders, visible in the choice of victims, the throat cuts, and the abdominal injuries, were treated as coincidence rather than pattern. Chapman's own background received the same cursory treatment given to Nichols. Her failed marriage, her children taken into care, and her occasional spells in the workhouse were noted only to establish identity, never to map the network of acquaintances who might have known what she feared. Coroner records reveal even more deliberate omissions. The post-mortem notes describe the removal of certain organs with surgical precision, yet the inquest transcript contains no sustained discussion of how such skill might link Chapman's death to the earlier attacks on Smith and Tabram, both of which had shown increasing focus on the torso. Witnesses who mentioned the leather apron rumors that had terrified the district after Tabram's murder were told the detail was irrelevant. No canvass was made of the Hanbury Street lodging houses to collect the warnings women had been exchanging. The official narrative settled on a lone madman whose motives could not be known, thereby erasing any suggestion that Chapman had recognized the same predator Nichols had encountered and had tried to avoid him. Press coverage completed the erasure in familiar fashion. Within hours, Chapman was reduced to the same shorthand applied to Nichols, a drunken prostitute whose life held no further interest beyond the gruesome details of her injuries. Newspapers printed sketches of the backyard and sensational accounts of the mutilations while omitting her attempts to earn an honest living, her conversations with other women about safety, and the specific warnings she had carried from the Britannia pub into the fog that morning. Later histories inherited this flattening, repeating the label without returning to the inquest testimony that showed a woman actively trading information to stay alive. The erased connections between Chapman and the earlier attacks therefore remained invisible to the wider public, preserved only in the unrecorded conversations of the women who walked the same streets and who understood that the pattern was growing clearer with each new body. What Chapman may have known died with her because the systems meant to document her final hours chose once again to simplify and discard the human threads that connected one murder to the next. The warnings circulating in Hanbury Street, the dismissed witnesses, and the incomplete mapping of her movements all point to knowledge that existed on the ground long before any official theory took shape. Like Nichols before her, Chapman understood the danger in ways the authorities never recorded, and her connections, observations, and final conversations slipped away into the same official silence that had already begun to define the case. Elizabeth Stride's murder arrived in the early hours of the 30th of September 1888, less than an hour after Annie Chapman had been discovered in the yard behind 29 Hanbury Street, and it immediately exposed the limits of the pattern that Nichols and Chapman had both tried to read. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in 1843 in a small parish near Gothenburg, Sweden, Stride had arrived in London in the 1860s, already carrying the layered identities that later histories would flatten into a single label. She had worked as a domestic servant, married a Swedish carpenter named John Stride, and for a time kept a coffee shop in Poplar before drink, debt, and the death of a child pushed her into the same lodging house circuit that Nichols and Chapman knew. By the summer of 1888, she was living at 32 Flower and Dean Street, sometimes using the name Long Liz, sometimes claiming to have been widowed in the Princess Alice disaster, a story that may have been invented to secure sympathy or simply repeated because it offered a ready explanation for her circumstances. Those who knew her described a woman who spoke several languages, kept her clothes mended, and moved between the Swedish community in the East End and the Irish and English women who shared her doss houses. The inquest would record only her age, her address, and the fact that she had been seen drinking earlier that evening, erasing the multilingual network of acquaintances who might have known what she had heard about the recent killings. Her body was found in Dutfield's yard, a narrow passage off Berner Street that ran beside the International Working Men's Educational Club. a socialist meeting place frequented by Jewish and Russian immigrants. The location itself carried political weight that investigators preferred not to examine. The club hosted lectures on anarchism and workers' rights, and its members had already attracted police attention for distributing pamphlets critical of the government. Stride had been seen earlier that night near the club, speaking with a man described as having a dark mustache and wearing a peaked cap, yet the proximity of her death to a site of radical political activity meant that any suggestion of a targeted killing was quickly steered away from questions of motive and toward the simpler conclusion of another random attack on a woman who sold herself on the streets. The double event, as the press would soon label the night that also claimed Catherine Eddowes, revealed a killer capable of striking twice within an hour and across a distance of roughly 3/4 of a mile, yet the official record treated Stride's murder as an interruption rather than a continuation. The absence of the abdominal mutilations that had marked Chapman suggested either that the killer had been disturbed or that the two deaths were not connected at all, a conclusion that allowed investigators to avoid confronting the possibility that the same man who had chosen Chapman had returned to the same streets and simply been forced to abandon his usual method. Witness accounts that might have clarified the interruption were dismissed with unusual speed. Israel Schwartz, a Hungarian immigrant, told police he had seen a man pull Stride into the passageway and heard her cry out. Yet his description of the attacker was never circulated widely, and his own reliability was questioned because of his accent and his status as a foreigner. Another man, James Brown, reported seeing Stride standing with a man in a long coat near the corner of Berner Street and Fairclough Street around 12:45 a.m., but Brown was never asked to attend an identity parade, and his statement was filed without follow-up. A woman who lived above the club claimed to have heard a stifled scream and the sound of something falling, yet her testimony was discounted because she had been woken from sleep and could not give an exact time. These accounts were not merely overlooked, they were actively sidelined by the pressure to present the murders as the work of a single, motiveless lunatic rather than a predator whose movements might be mapped through the very communities the authorities viewed with suspicion. Political pressures shaped the documentation of Stride's case more visibly than in the earlier murders. The Metropolitan Police were already under scrutiny for their handling of the Chapman inquest, and the presence of the Socialist Club on Berner Street raised fears that any hint of political assassination or immigrant involvement would inflame tensions already heightened by the leather apron panic and the xenophobic coverage in the popular press. Senior officers instructed constables to avoid canvassing the club members too aggressively, and the inquest presided over by Coroner Baxter again limited testimony to the immediate facts of discovery and medical cause of death. Questions about whether Stride had been carrying warnings from other women or whether she had altered her own movements after hearing of Chapman's death were ruled out of order. The post-mortem report noted a single cut to the throat and a partial severance of the windpipe, injuries consistent with the earlier victims, yet the absence of further mutilation was presented as evidence of a different hand rather than as proof that the killer had been interrupted mid-attack. No systematic effort was made to trace the man seen with Stride earlier that evening back through the lodging houses where she had spent the previous nights, nor were the women who had shared drinks with her at the Bricklayer's Arms asked to describe any conversations about safety or suspicious strangers. What Stride's murder forced London to confront, and what the official record therefore buried, was the growing realization that the pattern Nichols and Chapman had recognized was not confined to one small district and could not be explained away as the random work of a madman. The choice of Dutfield's Yard, so close to a site of political organizing, suggested that the killer might be moving through the same spaces where women exchanged information about danger, yet the investigation never attempted to reconstruct those exchanges. Stride's own history of moving between different immigrant communities meant she occupied a position from which she could have heard rumors that crossed linguistic lines, rumors that the police files contain only in fragments. The double event itself demonstrated that the killer was willing to strike again on the same night, a fact that should have prompted a broader alert to the women still working the streets, but the official response remained focused on containing public panic rather than amplifying the warnings already circulating among the victims themselves. Later press accounts completed the erasure by reducing Stride once more to the shorthand of a drunken prostitute whose death added little new information. Newspapers printed maps of the route between Berner Street and Mitre Square while omitting any discussion of the club or the dismissed witnesses whose statements might have linked the two killings. Subsequent histories inherited this narrowing, repeating the label of the double event without returning to the inquest material that showed a woman whose final movements had been observed by multiple people, none of whom were treated as credible. The political decision to treat Stride's murder as an outlier rather than as evidence of an expanding pattern therefore preserved the fiction that the author of violence could be contained within a single neighborhood and attributed to a single incomprehensible impulse. What the women of Whitechapel already understood, that the killer was learning, adapting, and choosing, remained locked inside the unrecorded conversations that official London had already decided were not worth preserving. Catherine Eddowes was released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 o'clock in the morning of the 30th of September 1888. Less than 45 minutes before her body was discovered in Mitre Square. The arresting constable had taken her in earlier that evening for being drunk and disorderly on Aldgate High Street, where she had been found performing a comedy imitation of a fire engine to a small audience of passers-by. She had given her name as Mary Ann Kelly and her address as Nowhere. By the time she was sober enough to be discharged, the night had turned cold and the streets between Bishopsgate and Mitre Square had emptied of the witnesses who might have seen what happened next. The officer who released her watched her walk east along the pavement and noted the direction in his log without following up. That brief observation, the direction she walked, the time she left, the absence of any further contact, became one of the most consequential failures of documentation in the entire case. Eddowes was heading directly back toward Whitechapel at the precise hour when the killer had already been forced to abandon his attack on Stride, and no one who knew the streets understood what that convergence meant until it was far too late. Born in Wolverhampton in 1842, Eddowes had lived a life that moved between respectability and precarity in ways that later histories consistently compressed into the single word of her final occupation. She had grown up in a large family, worked in a tin factory as a teenager, and spent years in the Midlands before relocating to London with a man named Thomas Conway, with whom she had 3 children and who she described as a pensioned soldier. Their relationship was volatile and eventually collapsed under the pressures of poverty and drink, but those who knew Eddowes in her later years described a woman of sharp intelligence and considerable wit, someone who read the newspapers carefully, debated politics in the lodging houses, and could write well enough to have contributed to a small publication Conway had once produced. By 1888 she was living with a market trader named John Kelly at 55 Flower and Dean Street, a few doors from where Elizabeth Stride had lodged, and the two women almost certainly knew each other by sight if not by name. That proximity, which should have been one of the first threads an investigator pulled, was never seriously examined. In the weeks before her death, Eddowes had followed the newspaper coverage of the Chapman and Nichols murders with the focused attention of someone who understood the streets those women had walked. Kelly later told police that she had spoken often about the killings and had expressed views about who might be responsible that were clearer and more grounded than anything the official investigation had produced. She did not believe the killer was a madman wandering at random. She believed he was a man who knew the lodging house district well, who understood its rhythms and its geography, and who was choosing women he had observed over time rather than simply taking whoever crossed his path in the dark. This assessment, which historians working from the full body of evidence have broadly confirmed, was shared by many of the women on those streets. It never appeared in any official record because no one thought to take a statement from Kelly until after Eddowes was dead, and even then the questioning focused almost entirely on the hours immediately before her arrest, rather than on the pattern she had identified across weeks of conversation. The circumstances of her release from Bishopsgate added a particular cruelty to the erasure. Had the duty sergeant known about the Stride murder that had occurred less than an hour before Eddowes walked out of the station door, he might have warned her, held her longer, or at least noted the alert that was already spreading through the Metropolitan Police. But Bishopsgate fell under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, a separate force with its own chain of command and its own communication failures, and the message about Stride's body had not yet crossed the jurisdictional boundary. Eddowes walked out into a city that was already hunting a man it could not describe to a woman who did not know the hunt was underway. She had perhaps 20 minutes of life remaining, and she spent them walking alone through streets she knew perfectly well, which is itself a measure of how little the official investigation had managed to communicate to the very population most at risk. In Mitre Square itself, the evidence that might have told the fuller story of her final minutes was systematically lost. The square had 3 entrances, 2 of which were monitored by police on regular patrols, and the third of which, a narrow passageway from Duke Street, was essentially unobservable from any of the surrounding buildings. Constable Edward Watkins passed through the square on his beat at 1:30 a.m. and found nothing. 14 minutes later he returned and found Eddowes' body. Within those 14 minutes someone had entered through the Duke Street passage, committed the most extensive mutilation of any victim so far, and departed. The medical evidence showed that the injuries took a minimum of 5 minutes to inflict and could have taken considerably longer. The killer had worked with confidence and speed in near total darkness, which told experienced observers something important about his familiarity with the square and its sightlines. That observation appeared in the private notes of City Police Surgeon Frederick Gordon Brown, but was softened considerably in the inquest testimony, where discussion of the killer's knowledge of the area would have implied a local man rather than the random vagrant that the public narrative required. The mutilations themselves carried information that the official record handled with deliberate selectivity. Brown's post-mortem examination documented the removal of a kidney and a portion of the womb, injuries that overlapped in specific ways with those inflicted on Chapman. The kidney in particular had been taken with a precision that Brown privately considered beyond the reach of an unskilled hand, a view shared by several medical colleagues who examined his findings. That assessment appeared in the inquest record in diluted form, with Brown acknowledging surgical skill, but qualifying it to the point where the qualification did the work the police needed. The killer was skillful, but not necessarily medically trained, an observation vague enough to direct suspicion away from any specific profession, while keeping the door open for the amateur theory that had gained traction after the Chapman inquest. What the record does not contain is any sustained attempt to correlate the specific organs taken from Chapman and Eddowes with a coherent hypothesis about motive or professional knowledge. The question of why those particular organs, and why with that particular care, was never put to any witness in a sustained or systematic way. A letter and postcard received by the Central News Agency in late September added another layer of evidence that the official investigation handled with a mixture of eagerness and negligence that has never been satisfactorily explained. The letter, now known by the salutation it carried, "Dear Boss," introduced the name Jack the Ripper to a watching public and made specific reference to the upcoming double event in terms that might indicate foreknowledge. Senior officers initially dismissed it as a hoax, then released it to the public in hope of generating leads, a decision that flooded the investigation with thousands of copycat letters and effectively buried any genuine correspondence under an avalanche of noise. More relevantly for Eddowes, a piece of her apron was found in a doorway on Golston Street in the heart of the Jewish community of Whitechapel, alongside a chalk inscription whose wording was recorded differently by different officers and which was erased on the direct order of Metropolitan Police Commissioner Charles Warren before it could be photographed. Warren's stated reason was that the inscription, whatever it said, risked inflaming anti-Semitic sentiment at a moment of community tension. The decision to destroy evidence in order to manage public order is one of the most extraordinary acts of institutional concealment in the history of the case, and its full implications were never subjected to any formal inquiry. What the erased inscription might have revealed has been debated for over a century. What is certain is that the piece of apron, almost certainly torn from Eddowes' clothing by the killer, indicated the route he had taken away from Meter Square, that the route led through the Jewish quarter, and that the discovery of a written message alongside his discarded evidence was treated primarily as a public order problem rather than as an investigative clue. The women of Flower and Dean Street, who heard about the apron and the inscription through the informal networks that carried information faster than any police bulletin, understood the geography of what it implied. They knew Golston Street. They knew which men lived there, which lodging houses opened their doors after midnight, and which of the men who came and went from the International Working Men's Educational Club also drank in the same pubs and slept in the same doss houses as the victims. The official investigation never traced those connections because doing so would have required treating the community's own knowledge as evidence, which was not a mode of inquiry that the Metropolitan Police or the city force had developed or was prepared to use. The inquest into Eddowes' death, held under City Coroner Samuel Langham, compressed the same pattern of erasure that had defined the earlier proceedings. Medical evidence was detailed and extensive. Witness testimony about her movements before her arrest was recorded without follow-up. John Kelly's account of her views on the murders was limited to confirming her identity and her lodging address. No questions were asked about what she had said concerning the killer's knowledge of the district, her assessment of which men she had noticed watching the lodging houses, or the conversations she had had with other women about the nights since Chapman's death. The community of Flower and Dean Street, one of the most densely networked populations in East London, whose residents traded information about clients, police movements, and street dangers as a matter of daily survival, was represented in the inquest record by a handful of witnesses who were asked only the most procedural questions. The knowledge those witnesses carried, knowledge that had been built across weeks of shared experience and cross-checked through dozens of conversations, was allowed to vanish from the official record as completely as if it had never existed. Press coverage followed the now established pattern with an efficiency that suggests the template had been set from the first victim. Eddowes' intelligence, her reading habits, her political conversations in the lodging houses, her long relationship with Kelly, and the specific views she had articulated about the murders, all of it disappeared behind the label. Newspapers printed her age, her address, a brief note about the arrest, and then moved on to diagrams of the square and descriptions of the wounds. The human being who had spent weeks thinking carefully about a pattern of danger was replaced by a collection of forensic details. Her name was not even the name she had given the police. She had died as Mary Ann Kelly, a name she had invented while drunk on Aldgate High Street, and the correction to her real name required a formal identification process that took several days and distracted attention from the investigative work that should have been the priority. The bureaucratic scramble to establish who she was consumed resources and time that might otherwise have been directed at understanding what she had known. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the canonical five, and the one about whom the least is reliably known. A paradox that becomes more troubling the more carefully it is examined. She was also the only victim who was killed indoors, in her own rented room at 13 Miller's Court, a fact that has led generations of writers to describe her death as somehow more intimate or more significant than the others, a claim that rests on a deeply uncomfortable logic. The indoor setting produced more evidence, more detailed documentation, and ultimately a more thorough official record than any of the previous murders. What it did not produce was any serious attempt to understand who Kelly was, where she came from, or what she might have known about the months of violence that had preceded her death. The very abundance of physical evidence in Miller's court seems to have satisfied investigators that nothing else was needed, and the result is a file that is simultaneously the richest in detail and the most complete in its erasure of the woman herself. Kelly told different stories about her origins to different people, which is itself a form of evidence that later histories have consistently misread. Some accounts had her born in Limerick in 1863, the daughter of an ironworks foreman who had moved the family to Wales when she was a child. Others placed her in Cardiff, or suggested she had worked in a high-class establishment in the West End before drifting into the East End through a series of relationships and misfortunes. These inconsistencies have been used to dismiss her self-accounts as fabrications, but that reading misunderstands the conditions under which women in Kelly's position routinely invented or altered their biographies. The lodging houses and the streets offered no protection for women who could be traced by violent former partners, by debt collectors, by workhouse officials reclaiming children, or simply by the social machinery that pulled women without resources back into institutional custody. A woman who told multiple stories about where she came from was exercising a reasonable survival strategy, not confessing to unreliability. The layers of her invented biographies, taken together, trace the shape of what she wanted to conceal, which is itself a form of testimony that investigators never thought to read. By 1888, Kelly was living at Miller's Court with a market porter named Joseph Barnett, a relationship that had ended badly in October when the couple quarreled over Kelly allowing another woman to share the room. The argument was almost certainly connected to money rather than simply to Kelly's generosity, as both she and Barnett were struggling to maintain even the most basic expenses of their shared life. Barnett continued to visit after the split, bringing food when he could and listening to Kelly read the newspaper accounts of the murders aloud. He later testified that the killings had frightened her deeply and that she had spoken about leaving the East End for her safety. What Barnett did not say, because no one asked him to elaborate, was what specifically Kelly had said about the murders that frightened her beyond the general horror that anyone might feel, whether she had identified connections between the victims that went beyond what the newspapers printed, whether she had spoken to any of the other women whose deaths were now part of the public record, and whether her fear had a specific object or suspect. All of this was left entirely unexplored. The weeks between Eddowes' death on the 30th of September and Kelly's on the 9th of November represented the longest gap in the series, and that gap itself carried information that was never properly examined. During those 6 weeks, the women of Miller's Court and Flower and Dean Street and Dorset Street had continued to exchange information, warnings, and observations with a focus sharpened by the double event. The community had not retreated into silence. It had, if anything, intensified its own parallel investigation. Women who had known Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes compared what they remembered of each woman's final days, noted which streets had grown quieter, and watched the men who moved through the lodging-house district with a more careful attention than at any point before. Some of this informal collective intelligence made its way into letters to the police, most of which were filed and forgotten. None of it was treated as a systematic source of investigative information. The 6-week gap was also a period during which the official investigation was publicly seen to be failing, a situation that produced pressure on senior officers to produce results and simultaneously made them more resistant to suggestions that the answer to the case lay not in the evidence collected at crime scenes, but in the community knowledge that existed before each crime occurred. Kelly's room at 13 Miller's Court was reached through a narrow arch from Dorset Street and consisted of a single ground floor space barely large enough for a bed, a table, a fireplace, and the boxes and clothing that accumulated in any rented room over months of occupation. She had fallen behind on her rent. 29 shillings were owed to the landlord John McCarthy, and had been managing the debt through a combination of appeals and avoidance. On the evening of the 8th of November, she was seen in the Britannia public house, where she had drinks with a man described as stout, with a blotchy face and a thick mustache, and later in the evening with several other acquaintances, at least one of whom had also known Annie Chapman. She returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. A woman named Mary Cox, who lived at the far end of the court, passed her on the way in and exchanged a few words. Cox noted that Kelly was not noticeably intoxicated and was singing as she walked through the arch. The song she was singing was Only a Violet, the first plucked from my mother's grave, a popular music hall number of the period whose sentimental lyrics about maternal loss and the passage of time have struck many later readers as poignant in retrospect. Whether Kelly chose it for those reasons or simply because it was a song she knew and liked is not something the record allows us to answer. What the record does allow us to answer is when the singing stopped. Cox returned to her own room and heard Kelly singing for approximately another 45 minutes before silence fell. At around 3 or 4 in the morning, witnesses gave conflicting times. A woman named Sarah Lewis, who was staying in another room in the court, heard a sharp cry of murder but assumed it was a street disturbance and did not investigate. Lewis's account is one of the more consistently recorded testimonies in the entire case, not because it received more thorough treatment at the inquest, but because it was brief enough and specific enough that it could be written down without generating follow-up questions. Her statement, like all the others from Miller's Court, was recorded and then filed without any attempts to build from it a picture of what the court's residents had heard, seen, and suspected over the preceding weeks. Kelly's body was discovered at approximately 10:45 in the morning of the 9th of November when Barnett arrived at the room, found the door locked, and peered through a broken window pane. He reported what he had seen to McCarthy, who sent his assistant to the police. The decision to wait for instructions from senior officers before entering the room meant that the body was not formally examined until afternoon, by which time a crowd had gathered in Dorset Street and Miller's Court had been thoroughly compromised as a crime scene by the simple passage of time and people. The room itself, when it was finally entered, presented investigators with a degree of physical evidence that none of the outdoor murder sites had produced. Blood distribution patterns, fragments of burned clothing in the fireplace, a bonnet, a shawl, the remnants of a coat. Photographs were taken, the only crime scene photographs in the entire canonical case, and these images have become among the most disturbing in Victorian forensic history. What they documented was the consequence of an attack that may have lasted several hours, and that was of a severity qualitatively different from anything that had preceded it. The photographs and the post-mortem report dominated the inquest to the exclusion of almost everything else. Coroner Roderick MacDonald presided over proceedings that lasted a single day and concluded with a jury verdict of willful murder by some person or persons unknown. The speed of the inquest was unusual enough to prompt comment at the time. Several jurors indicated they would have preferred to hear more witnesses before returning a verdict. MacDonald overruled them, citing the need for the jury's well-being and the limited new information that additional testimony was likely to produce. The effect was to foreclose any extended examination of Kelly's history, her connections to the earlier victims, and the specific nature of the fear Barnett had described her expressing in the weeks before her death. The burned clothing in the fireplace was noted but never adequately explained. The leading theory was that the killer had burned it to provide light for his work, which raises questions about the length and nature of the attack that the inquest did not pursue. The cumulative weight of what was erased across these 5 cases is not simply the personal histories of 5 women, though those histories matter in their own right. What was erased was a system of knowledge, distributed, practical, and in several crucial respects more accurate than the official investigation, that the community of women in Whitechapel had been assembling from the first attacks of the spring of 1888 onward. That system of knowledge had a specific character that distinguishes it from the gossip or superstition that official commentators dismissed it as. It was empirical in the sense that it was built from direct observation. It was cumulative in the sense that each new piece of information was checked against the existing body of shared understanding. It was mobile in the sense that it traveled rapidly through the lodging houses and public houses and street corners that constituted the communication infrastructure of the East End poor. And it was consequential in the sense that it was actively shaping the behavior of women who acted on it to try to protect themselves from a danger the authorities had been slower to recognize and name. The knowledge Mary Ann Nichols carried on the night of the 31st of August about the earlier attacks on Emma Smith and Martha Tabram was the seed of this collective understanding. The warnings Annie Chapman voiced in the Britannia pub on the evening of the 7th of September, that a single man, not a gang, was responsible, that he chose women who worked alone after midnight, represented its first articulate form. The dismissed testimony of Israel Schwartz, the erased inscription on the wall in Golston Street, the unasked questions at every inquest, each of these represents a point at which the official record actively chose not to receive the information that was being offered. The choice was made for different reasons in each case: to protect community relations, to manage public panic, to maintain jurisdictional boundaries, to satisfy the press's appetite for a simpler and more sensational narrative. But the cumulative effect was singular. An investigation that had access to a living, self-organized, highly motivated body of observers chose instead to document wounds. The connections between Kelly and the earlier victims were extensive but remained invisible in the official record. She had almost certainly known Annie Chapman, who had lodged at 35 Dorset Street, the same street onto which Miller's Court opened. The women who drank at the Britannia on the corner of Dorset Street included regulars who had also drunk with Nichols and Eddowes in the weeks before their deaths. The lodging house circuit that connected all 5 women to Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, and Dorset Street was a small enough geography that its regular inhabitants were unlikely to be strangers to one another. The 6 weeks between Eddowes and Kelly were 6 weeks in which this community of connected women was actively processing what it knew and feared. Yet the inquest into Kelly's death contained no attempt to trace those connections or to reconstruct what information Kelly herself might have been carrying when she walked back through the arch into Miller's Court on the night of the 8th of November. Joseph Barnett's testimony, the closest the inquest came to any account of Kelly's inner life and observations, was handled with a narrowness that in retrospect seems almost calculated. He was asked about her address, her drinking habits, the reason for their quarrel, and the amount of rent she owed. He was not asked what she thought about the murders. He was not asked whether she had mentioned anyone she was afraid of, or whether she had spoken about any of the women who had died, or whether she had changed her habits in the weeks since Eddowes' death in ways that suggested specific knowledge or specific fear. The newspaper accounts of Barnett's testimony filled in some of these gaps with paraphrase and reported speech that carries the weight of his evident distress, and what those accounts suggest is that Kelly had been very frightened and had tried to leave but had not been able to. What they do not tell us, because the question was never properly put, is why. Whether her fear was general or specific, whether it had a face attached to it, whether she had said anything to the women she drank with on the night of the 8th about the man she had been seen with earlier, remains unanswered. The record closes with the inquest verdict. The woman inside the record had already been reduced to her injuries before the proceedings were a day old. The women who survived those months and continued to live on those streets carried the knowledge the record refused. Some of them gave interviews to journalists in the years and decades that followed. Some of them were still alive when the first serious historical reassessments began in the early 20th century, but by then the damage was done. The narrative of a nameless, unknowable, brilliant killer operating in an otherwise passive and helpless community had been printed into the historical record with enough repetition to become effectively permanent. The actual record, available in the inquest transcripts and the surviving police files, and the local newspaper coverage that had not yet been homogenized into the national sensational template, told a different story. one of women who were not passive, who were actively thinking and communicating and making assessments, and whose intelligence was systematically excluded from the investigation that was nominally trying to protect them. This exclusion was not incidental to the investigation, it was structural. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 had no methodology for treating members of a stigmatized community as reliable witnesses. The inquest system had no procedural mechanism for capturing informal community knowledge and incorporating it into the formal record. The press had no commercial incentive to represent women without property or social standing as thinking beings whose observations deserved the same weight as those of a surgeon or a constable. Each of these structural absences reinforced the others, and together they created the conditions in which an investigative failure could be rationalized as the consequence of an unknowable killer rather than of a knowable community that was never properly heard. What the 5 women knew, collectively and individually, was not enough to prevent their deaths. The knowledge was real, but the danger was real too, and the streets of Whitechapel at midnight in the autumn of 1888 offered no safe harbor to a woman who needed 4 pence for a bed. What the 5 women knew might, however, have been enough to produce a working description of a suspect before the 6th, 7th, 8th death, before the case became the permanent open wound in the record of unsolved violence that it remains today. The failure to collect and use what they knew was not a failure of evidence, it was a failure of recognition. London in 1888 simply could not bring itself to look at women like Nichols and Chapman and Stride and Eddowes and Kelly and see, behind the label it had assigned them, the active and observant minds that were doing the only investigative work the case ever produced on the ground. There is a particular quality to the silence in the inquest records. Reading them in order, from the Nichols proceedings in September through the truncated single-day hearing into Kelly's death in November, one notices that the questions which are not asked form as clear a pattern as the questions which are. No coroner in any of the 5 inquests asked a witness what any of the dead women had said about their fear. No coroner asked a witness to describe the informal network of warnings that moved through the lodging houses. No coroner asked whether any of the dead women had identified a specific suspect or a specific type of man before they died. These were not questions that required investigative sophistication to formulate. They were the obvious questions that would have occurred to anyone who understood that these women had been alive, thinking, talking, and afraid for weeks before they died. The fact that none of the 5 inquests produced them tells us something definitive about what the system was designed to receive. The police files add a different kind of silence. They are extensive, meticulous in some respects, and full of papers that chase leads into blind alleys. What they do not contain is any document that reflects a deliberate attempt to reconstruct the shared knowledge of the community most at risk. There is no record of a systematic canvass of the lodging houses on Flower and Dean Street or Thrall Street after the Nichols murder, of the kind that would have produced a list of every woman who had shared a room with Nichols in the weeks before her death, and who might have reported what she feared. There is no record of a meeting with the keepers of the common lodging houses to establish which clients had been noted as unusually threatening in the months before the killings began. There is no record of an attempt to map the movements of the victims against the geography of the 2 earlier attacks, on Smith and Tabram, in a way that might have revealed a consistent pattern of location and method. These are not sophisticated investigative techniques that were beyond the capacity of Victorian policing. They are basic procedures of intelligence gathering that the investigation chose not to apply to a community it had already decided was not a reliable source of evidence. The women knew. That is the uncomfortable center of this story, and it is uncomfortable not because it accuses any individual of negligence or malice, though some individual decisions in the case were certainly negligent and some may have been worse, but because it implicates a system. The system that produced the inquest into Mary Ann Nichols on the 3rd of September 1888, was the same system that would have produced an inquest into any subsequent victim of the same killer, and it was not capable of hearing what the community had to say. The women of Whitechapel understood that before the first inquest was over, they saw their friend reduced to a label in a coroner's court while their knowledge of her final weeks was left outside the door. They watched the same thing happen to Chapman, to Stride, to Eddowes, to Kelly. By November of 1888, those who survived understood something that the official investigation never fully grasped, that the system was not going to protect them, not because the men running it were evil, but because those men had built a way of seeing that simply could not accommodate the kind of evidence the women carried. That understanding changed how the surviving women moved through the streets. It did not make them safe. No understanding could make them safe in those conditions, but it produced a kind of collective vigilance that operated entirely outside the official record. The lodging house keepers began tracking which men had been seen with multiple victims. The women who used the same streets began coordinating their movements more explicitly. Pub landlords in the district started paying closer attention to customers they did not recognize. None of this informal protective infrastructure was documented in any official file because official files were not designed to receive it. It exists only in the fragments of later testimony, in the occasional journalist's account, in the letters some of these women wrote to newspapers that printed fragments of them amid the ongoing coverage of a case they were already turning into a commercial property. The commercial transformation of the case had its own erasure effects. From very early in the autumn of 1888, the murders were being packaged for consumption by a national and eventually international audience, for whom Whitechapel was not a neighborhood they lived in, but a spectacle they consumed from a safe distance. That audience wanted a certain kind of story. A brilliant, mysterious killer, a baffled but energetic police force, a dangerous district that confirmed existing beliefs about the poor, and a set of victims whose degradation justified both their deaths and the prurient interest with which those deaths were discussed. The women themselves were not characters in that story. They were properties, and properties did not need to have been thinking, observing, or communicating before they died. The richer and stranger story of 5 women who understood the danger better than the authorities did, and whose understanding was systematically discarded, was never commercially appealing because it required the audience to take those women seriously as human beings, which was precisely what the established conventions of both journalism and criminal investigation were designed not to do. The case that is commonly called the Jack the Ripper murders is the most documented cold case in the history of crime. Hundreds of books have been written about it. Documentaries, films, walking tours, museum exhibitions, and online communities have been dedicated to it for over a century. In virtually all of this material, the 5 women function as a backdrop against which the more interesting question, who was the killer, is played out. They are given brief biographical notes and then assigned to their positions as victims. Their thoughts, their connections, their observations, and their fear are not the subject of investigation. The killer is. This is not a failure that belongs to any single researcher or any single era. It is a habit of attention that was established by the original investigation and the original press coverage, and that subsequent generations have largely inherited without examining. When we ask who Jack the Ripper was, we are asking the question that the official record was designed to make us ask, because that is the question the official record organized itself around. When we ask instead what Mary Ann Nichols knew, what Annie Chapman told her friends at the Britannia, what Catherine Eddowes said to John Kelly about the pattern she saw emerging in the lodging house district, we are asking the questions that the official record was designed to prevent us from asking, because those questions lead not to a single brilliant criminal mind, but to a community of women whose knowledge was real and whose erasure was deliberate. The deliberateness of that erasure is perhaps the most important thing to understand. The inquests were not carelessly run. The coroners were educated men who knew their procedures and followed them. The police who attended those inquests were not lazy or stupid. The journalists who covered the case were skilled professionals who understood narrative. Each of them in their own domain made choices about what to record and what to leave out, and those choices consistently fell the same way, toward the evidence that documented the killer's work and away from the evidence that documented the victims' lives. The pattern is too consistent across 5 separate proceedings, under different coroners, different police officers, and different newspaper editors, to be explained as coincidence. It reflects a shared set of assumptions about whose knowledge counts as evidence and whose does not, assumptions that were deeply embedded in the culture of Victorian institutions and that have proved remarkably durable across the century and a half that has elapsed since the autumn of 1888. Recognizing those assumptions is the beginning of reading the case differently, not with the aim of finally identifying the killer. That aim may be permanently beyond reach, and the energy devoted to it has itself been part of the mechanism that keeps the women in their place as props rather than protagonists. But with the aim of recovering, as fully as the surviving sources allow, what the 5 women knew and how they knew it and what the loss of that knowledge meant for the investigation and for the community that survived them. The knowledge was real. The erasure was real. The women were real. And the least we owe them at this distance is to stop asking who killed them and start asking what they understood about the world that killed them and why no one in a position of authority thought that understanding was worth preserving.